Hard Knocks in Mill City, the Minneapolis Marines and the Minneapolis Red Jackets. A presentation by Ryan R.C. Christensen. This presentation is based on the information in the book Mill City Scrum, the history of Minnesota's first team in the National Football League, which contains the entire history of the Minneapolis Marines and Minneapolis Red Jackets football teams during the years 1905 through 1930. The book has been published through Amazon, and it is available through Amazon internationally and at all other major online booksellers. Minneapolis before the Marines. One of the nicknames for Minneapolis is the Mill City, due to the fact the city became the nation's leader in flour production with flour mills on the banks of the Mississippi River at St. Anthony Falls. The flour industry, along with the lumber industry, attracted settlers from the eastern and midwestern United States and attracted immigrants from Europe and Scandinavia. In most of the United States, baseball preceded football, and the same is true in the Twin Cities. As early as 1877, both Minneapolis and St. Paul had teams affiliated with the National League. Minneapolis had the Millers, who played at Nicollet Park, and St. Paul had the Saints, who played at Lexington Park. Football came later, and the first game of college football in the Twin Cities was played between the University of Minnesota and Hamline University. Soon, the College of St. Thomas, Macalester College, and Concordia University fielded teams, as did the local high schools. Early on, the college teams played the high school teams, and eligibility for both sets of teams remained fluid. Eventually, the University of Minnesota hired Dr. Henry L. Williams, a former Yale football teammate of Amos Alonzo Stagg and Pudge Heffelfinger, to coach the Gophers. Williams previously coached Army at West Point by correspondence, a technique that informed his coaching habits at the U of M. Williams would coach the Gophers through 1921, and his win-loss record, and certainly his scoring record, may never be eclipsed by another Gophers coach. The Minneapolis Marines were not the first professional team in Minnesota or in Minneapolis. The first professional team in Minneapolis was the Deans, named after the team's sponsor, James H. Dean of the Federal Ballot Machine Company. The Deans hired former Gophers star Bobby Marshall to play for and coach the team. The Deans played in a Sunday league, and they played exhibition games on Thanksgiving Day, including against the Eckersalls, a professional team from Chicago led by Walter Eckersall, the former University of Chicago Maroons star. The Minneapolis Deans were the product of independent amateur football in the Twin Cities, where teams played in ad hoc weight classes, and newspapers published notices, challenges, results, and grievances for the team on the sports pages. This is a picture of one of those early teams, but the team is unknown. One of the early teams, the Henley Athletic Association, stands out because they played 3 games in 4 days. First against the high school team from Alexandria, Minnesota, and second against North Dakota Agricultural College, now NDSU. Before their third game against the University of North Dakota, the Henleys were so beat up they imbibed on alcohol beforehand to kill the pain. Of course, independent amateur baseball also flourished in the Twin Cities, and in 1905, 16-year-old Henry Harrison Pecky Rhodes, a pitcher, started his own baseball team, and he called them the Marines. Rhodes lived in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood of Minneapolis, on the west bank of the Mississippi River across from the University of Minnesota, and southeast of the Milling District, where the Scandinavian immigrants congregated. It's not clear where the Marines name comes from. One account says the name came from a team that had dissolved, and then some of those players went on to play for Rhodes. In the fall, some of the Marines players started a football team, and for several years, the baseball and football teams shared rosters. The baseball team disbanded in 1913 after Rhodes went on to play professional baseball in the affiliated minor leagues. The Marines in the Sandlot. The Marines football team that formed from the Marines baseball team played in the Sandlots through 1909, and during this period, 6 future NFL players joined the team, including Art Gausted, Walt Bueland, Al Radine, Ruben Ursella, Charles Jonason, and Mike Palmer. And one Marines player, John Dunn, would go on to serve as NFL vice president for several years. While playing in the Sandlots, the Marines claimed the championship in their weight class in 1908. During this early period, the Marines played most of their games at Minnehaha Park, and seen here is Minnehaha Falls within the park. They enjoyed a dominant winning record, and their main rival was the Indians, a team led by Einar Jurgens, a Norwegian immigrant who had been involved with independent football in Minneapolis since 1898, when he first played guard for the Lincoln Athletic Club. In 1909, the Indians temporarily disbanded, and the Marines absorbed some of the Indians' players. Jurgens managed the Marines that season, and 3 of Einar Jurgens' sons would go on to play for the Marines in later years. The semi-professional Marines. In 1910, the team selected Frank J. Hammer, who was an apprentice in the newspaper trade, to be their new manager. And Hammer would turn the Marines Sandlot team into a semi-professional operation with a rented venue, ticket sales, fundraisers, and even a pep band. The Marines continued to absorb former players from the Indians, and they established new rivalries against the Beavers of Minneapolis and the Laurels of St. Paul. Marines games attracted thousands of fans to their home games at the North Minneapolis Athletic Association grounds. While the Beavers and Laurels and other opponents featured former high school and college players, the Marines remained an untutored aggregation of first-generation American working men. One of the players who had an immediate impact on the Marines was Ruben Ursella, a first-generation American of Italian heritage. He joined the team in 1907 and emerged as the team's coach, and he became a fan favorite with his ability to run the ball for long stretches around the ends, but especially for his abilities as a drop kicker. During this period in 1911, a full 2 years before the Marines hired a coach, Ursella had figured out how to run the Minnesota shift offense, the same offense first used by the University of Minnesota Gophers in 1910 to tremendous success. As early as 1908, the Marines were noted for their machine-like formations, and so they were already disciplined enough to adopt the shift. How Ursella learned the shift, or whether he perhaps had a hand in its origins, remains a mystery. By 1912, the Marines had emerged as a nearly unstoppable scoring machine. Remember, for more information, you can read the book Mill City Scrum: The History of Minnesota's First Team in the National Football League by R. C. Christensen. Visit mplsmarines.com for more information. Professionals. In 1913, the Marines transitioned to playing as a fully professional operation when they hired Ossie Solom, a University of Minnesota student and former Gophers player, to be their coach. Frank Hammer continued as the team manager through 1914. But then, after the North Minneapolis Athletic Association sued the team over lost revenue, longtime player John Dunn took over management of the team, and they moved to Nicollet Park for home games. When Solom left to coach elsewhere, former Gophers player Russell Tollefson took over for a season, and when he left, Ursela resumed his duties as both coach and quarterback. During this period, the Marines started to play annual Thanksgiving Day games against the Minnesota All-Stars exhibition team, and the Marines acquired 5 more players who later played in the NFL, including Bobby Marshall, Fred Chicken, Harry Gunderson, Art Sampson, and Eddie Novak. The Minnesota All-Stars were an ad hoc exhibition team originally put together by former Gophers All-American player John McGovern for the purpose of playing an exhibition game at Nicollet Park on Thanksgiving Day. Early on, the university sponsored the team. The Beavers played the first game in 1912, but thereafter the Marines became the staple opponent for the Minnesota All-Stars on Thanksgiving Day. The teams did not play an exhibition game in 1917 due to the war effort. During this period, the Beavers remained the Marines' main rivals until the Beavers folded in 1914, and then the East Ends presented the heaviest local challenge for the Marines. The Marines would absorb players from both rival teams. Instead of claiming titles for themselves, newspapers anointed the Marines with titles, and the team received its highest compliment in 1916, when the Daily Times of Davenport, Iowa, dubbed the team the Pride of the Northwest. The Marines peaked twice during this period. First in fan interest in 1913, when Ursela scored 101 points on the season, and 8,000 fans showed up to watch the Marines beat the Beavers 33-7 at Nicollet Park. The Marines peaked again in 1917 in regional stature, when they proved they were a regional powerhouse, and they beat Duluth City, Davenport, Rock Island twice, and Camp Dodge. The Marines played in front of their second largest crowd when they played the Minnesota All-Stars to a scoreless tie on Thanksgiving Day, 1916. Using the Minnesota shift, and by accumulating the best, mostly non-college talent from the Twin Cities, the Marines trashed their opponents by nearly a 10-to-1 ratio on the scoreboard. When fan interest in the Marines peaked in 1913, the Minneapolis Park System formed the Twin City Amateur Football League in 1914 to organize the sandlot teams in the Twin Cities so that they would no longer compete for playing fields. The Park League drew fan interest away from professional football, and the newspapers scolded the Marines and other teams for continuing down the path of professionalism. Several Marines players found side gigs during this period as ringers, most significantly in games in Duluth and Rock Island. By the end of this period, despite the Marines' success on the field, interest in professional football waned in the Twin Cities. And when Marines players played as ringers in Rock Island in 1917, they discovered a new home for glory, and in the future, the experience would sink the Marines. The Great War, World War I. Several Marines players served during World War I, a few of them in battle. Perhaps many more players than listed here also served. Those Marines players who did serve often found themselves playing on service teams, most significantly Fred Chicken for the U.S. Army Air Service Mechanics School in St. Paul, and Reuben Ursella for the 604th Engineering Regiment in France. Chicken's stint with the service team included 2 games against Rock Island, which would contribute to the Marines' ultimate demise as a powerhouse team. The Rock Island Ripoff. After the war, a total of 8 former Marines players would play in Rock Island, where Ursella would coach the team in using the Minnesota shift. With Ursella as their coach, and with a total of 6 former Marines players on the team, the Rock Island Independents used the Minnesota shift to outscore opponents 309 points to 12 in 1919. And Ursella would have his best season in pro football by scoring 106 points. The Independents would challenge the Canton Bulldogs for bragging rights, and when Canton refused to play them, Rock Island claimed the title Champions of the USA. Reuben Ursella and Fred Chicken had a significant impact on the scoreboard for both the Minneapolis Marines and the Rock Island Independents from 1912 through 1919, when their teams outscored opponents 1,725 points to 157 points. Of all players, Ursella had the greatest impact on the outcomes of the games. Meanwhile, the Marines filled holes in their lineup, and 7 new players who joined the team would play in the NFL, including Rudy Tersch, Larry Erickson, John Norbeck, Oscar Christensen, Einar Cleve, Harold D. Hansen, and Frank Jordan. Former Gophers Jimmy Rush and Russell Tollefson coached the team, and Val Ness, a future Minneapolis NFL franchise investor, played for the team. Despite losing their playmakers to the Rock Island Independents, the Marines continued to put a successful team on the field. In 1920, the Decatur Staleys, also known as the future Chicago Bears, put up a good argument that they should be named champions of the APFA, the future NFL. Against the Staleys, the Marines and ex-Marines in Rock Island allowed the Staleys to score only 10 points. The Staleys beat Rock Island 7-0 and tied 0-0, and beat the Marines 3-0. What if Rock Island had never ripped off the best players from the Marines? Remember, for more information, you can read the book Mill City Scrum: The History of Minnesota's First Team in the National Football League by R. C. Christensen. Visit mplsmarines.com for more information. In the National Football League. When the Marines joined the American Professional Football Association in 1921, which would become the National Football League in 1922, the University of Minnesota Gophers were at a low point, and the university forced Coach Williams out. This opened the door for the Marines to renew interest in professional football by hosting some of the best teams in the nation. Russell Tollefson continued to coach and then was replaced by Harry Mara and later Joe Brandy. After 2 seasons in Rock Island, Ruben Ursella returned to the Marines in 1921. The NFL elected Marines team manager John Dunn vice president in 1922. And that year he fielded a second minor professional team to serve as the Marines practice squad. Contract disputes in 1922 led Dunn to form a corporation to establish clear boundaries between the NFL franchise and the Marine Athletic Club. During this period after the war, the Minnesota All-Stars exhibition team changed in nature after John McGovern handed over the reins to other organizers. The team grew to be less organized around former Gophers players, and the Marines had an easier time with the All-Stars. By 1924, another local team, the Liberties, who featured John McNally, who at that time went by the name Melvin Blood, had become more popular than the Marines, and the Liberties played in the annual Thanksgiving Day game instead of the Marines. Football fans in Minneapolis showed little interest in professional football played against teams from all over the country, and the Marines did not play well. They fell out of favor, even with members of the local semi-professional football community. Meanwhile, Park League football continued to grow as 30,000 spectators watched 100 teams play on park fields each Sunday. Intermission. In late 1924, John Dunn tried to move his NFL franchise to Rochester, Minnesota, and he tried again in 1925. But Rochester showed no interest in the team, so he put his NFL franchise on ice for the next 4 seasons. Meanwhile, Marines players moved on to other teams. Dunn and his investors tried to revive their NFL franchise in 1926 as the Twin City Lumberjacks. But one of the promised investors, head coach Joe Brandy, asked to be paid a salary instead, and so the deal fell through. Meanwhile, organizers in Rochester, Minnesota decided they would like to have a professional team after all, but not by hosting an NFL franchise. Instead, they rebranded the Liberties from Minneapolis to play as the independent Rochester Aces. The players from the Liberties, or Aces, went on to play as the Twin City All-Stars against the Duluth Eskimos and other opponents in 1926. Dunn and his investors revived the Minneapolis Marines as an exhibition team to play the New York Yankees in 1927 and the Chicago Bears and Green Bay Packers in 1928. The 1928 version of the Marines were led by Herb Joesting, who had turned down offers from teams who offered less for his services than they had offered Red Grange. The former Gopher, Joesting, instead played for the local team, the Marines. Even though John Dunn didn't field a team during this period, he held on to his NFL franchise, and he served as vice president for the National Football League. During his time as a league officer, he suggested the league should adopt a draft, divide into conferences, use a playoff system, and play a championship game. But the league temporarily overlooked those ideas. This is not to say those ideas were solely Dunn's, but his team might surely have benefited from a draft system and Eastern and Western conferences. Meanwhile, the Minneapolis Park League had grown to include 150 teams. In 1928, the corporate-sponsored Fauchets took the field with future Chicago Cardinals phenom Joe Lillard in the backfield. As many as 15,000 fans watched Lillard and the Fauchets compete first in the Minneapolis championship game and 15,000 more for the Twin Cities championship game in 1928. The Minneapolis Red Jackets. In the wake of his father's death, John Dunn revived his NFL franchise as the Minneapolis Red Jackets, a team likely named after the 1st Minnesota Infantry, who fought in red shirts during the Civil War. Dunn hired Joesting to lead the team, and Joesting later received assistance from longtime Gophers assistant and Fauchets coach Sig Harris. The 1929 Red Jackets included Ruben Urcela, and the 1930 version included 3 players from the University of Southern California. The team held spring training at a resort in northern Minnesota and wore all red uniforms from head to toe. The Minneapolis Red Jackets had a decent roster, especially in 1930. But on the field, the Red Jackets only won 2 NFL games, and the team suffered at the gate. To stop the bleeding, John Dunn and his investors sold most of the players to the Frankfurt Athletic Association, who fielded the Frankfurt Yellow Jackets franchise in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And for the rest of the season, Frankfurt used players from both rosters to play out the Red Jackets and Yellow Jackets schedules. 3 men, George Gibson, Nate Berriger, and Herb Joesting, played in every Red Jackets and Yellow Jackets game after November 2nd, 9 in total, and a few of them back-to-back Saturday and Sunday affairs. The Red Jackets' 1930 season and Marines football history ended on December 7, 1930, at Universal Stadium in Portsmouth, Ohio, in a 42-0 loss to the Portsmouth Spartans, today's Detroit Lions. Today, at 300 Cedar Avenue in Minneapolis, which is where the Marine Athletic Club had their headquarters for many seasons, there is now just an empty lot with a couple of trees. But from that empty lot, you can have an unimpeded view of US Bank Stadium and the administrative offices of the Minnesota Vikings. Remember, for more information, you can read the book Mill City Scrum, The History of Minnesota's First Team in the National Football League by R.C. Christensen. Visit mplsmarines.com for more information. This concludes this presentation.